Elizabeth I, one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history. Her reign, often referred to as the Elizabethan Era, was a period of significant cultural, economic, and political flourishing. With the establishment of English Protestantism and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, just a few of her notable achievements. Her skillful management of Parliament and her moderate religious policies helped stabilize a kingdom previously torn apart by religious conflict. But she never married, which earned her the moniker the Virgin Queen, and her leadership provided the stability that enabled the arts to thrive, with figures like William Shakespeare defining the age. Hello and welcome to the channel. Is it your first time? Well, if it is, welcome. And if you're coming back, it's great to see you again. As always, if you want to go above and beyond to support the channel, links are in the description. Otherwise, the best way to support is by liking, subscribing, and just enjoying the video. Now, with that being said, let's all get nice and comfortable, take a deep breath, and relax, and we can begin our full biography of Queen Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth Tudor entered this world on September the 7th, 1533. She was born at Greenwich Palace, bearing the names of her esteemed grandmothers, being Elizabeth of York and Lady Elizabeth Howard. She was the second child of Henry VIII of England to survive infancy within the bonds of marriage. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, second out of 6, by the way, gave birth to Elizabeth, who at her birth was the heir presumptive to the English throne. However, her half-sister Mary had lost her position as a legitimate heir due to Henry's annulment of his marriage to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, and his subsequent marriage to Anne, all in pursuit of siring a male heir to ensure the Tudor succession. Elizabeth was baptized quickly on September 10th, 1533, 3 days after her death, with prominent figures such as Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, serving as her godparents. Tragedy struck, however, when she was just 2 years and 8 months old. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had her head removed. Yes, on May 19th, 1536. And Elizabeth, well, she was declared illegitimate, losing her place in royal succession. Shortly after Anne's execution, Henry married one Jane Seymour, who did manage to bear him a son, being Edward, cementing his position as the undisputed heir apparent to the throne. Elizabeth was then placed in her half-brother's household and participated in his christening, holding the chrisom or baptismal cloth. Well, despite all of these uncertainties and challenges of her early years, Elizabeth demonstrated a keen intellect and a thirst for knowledge. Under the tutelage of her governesses and tutors, such as Catherine Champernowne, later known as Catherine Ashley, and William Grindal, she mastered multiple languages, among them including French, Dutch, Italian, and Spanish, all of the big ones for effective diplomacy, by the way, at the time, especially French and Spanish. By the age of 12, She could even translate religious works and classical texts from Latin and Greek into English, and other languages as well. Her education continued under Roger Ascham, who fostered a love of learning and intellectual curiosity in Elizabeth, ensuring she became one of the best educated women of her time, especially at such a young age. Quite impressive. Well, old Henry VIII, he wasn't around forever either, and he died in 1547. And following his death, Elizabeth's half-brother, Edward VI, assumed the throne at the very young age of 9 years old. Catherine Parr, Henry's widow, remarried Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudley, who was Edward's uncle and the brother of the Lord Protector Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. The newlywed couple welcomed Elizabeth warmly into their household at Chelsea, where she encountered a rather troubling episode that, as some scholars speculate, had a lasting impact on her emotional well-being. Now, I don't generally like to supply these kinds of warnings, but in the interest of all of my audience, those who do not want to hear any SA-related material, please skip forward a few minutes. Thank you. Thomas Seymour engaged in, let's just say, inappropriate behavior with Elizabeth. This included some rather touchy-feely playing, and tickling even, crossing more than a few lines, it seems. Apparently he would also enter her bedroom at night wearing his night clothes. Not cool, especially since she was only 14 at the time. Well, very uncomfortable with these unwanted advances, Elizabeth would rise early and surround herself with maids to avoid his unwelcome morning visits. But shockingly, rather than addressing her husband's behavior, Parr actually participated in these activities. On one occasion, she even held Elizabeth so she couldn't move while Seymour cut her gown into pieces. Well, it didn't last forever. The fun had to end when Parr, perhaps feeling a little bit jealous, put an end to the situation after she walked in one day on Seymour rather forcefully embracing Elizabeth. Well, despite Parr's intervention, Thomas Seymour continued his attempts to exert influence over the royal family. Following Parr's death in childbirth on September the 5th, 1548, Seymour renewed his advances towards Elizabeth, with the intention of actually marrying her. Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, who favoured Seymour, encouraged Elizabeth to console him in his grief, whatever that means. However, Elizabeth, of course being intelligent, especially for her age, remained very skeptical of Seymour's motives, doubting his sincerity in mourning, perhaps trying to get one out of sympathy. Well, in January 1549, Seymour's ambitions led to his arrest and imprisonment in the Tower of London, which is not a place you would want to be imprisoned in. He was thrown in there, locked up on suspicion of plotting against his brother Somerset, orchestrating a marriage between Lady Jane Grey and Edward VI, and also the attitudes towards Elizabeth, and seeking to wed her, which was seen as not cool. Well, despite intense interrogation, Elizabeth steadfastly maintained her innocence, frustrating her interrogator, Robert Thirlwit, who believed that she had a part in this and was as guilty as anybody else. Well, sticking to her guns certainly proved to be advantageous, because she managed to get away with everything, although she hadn't really done anything. But, politics. Seymour, however, well, he was executed on March 20th, 1549, bringing an end to his tumultuous pursuit of power and his seeking of marriage to Elizabeth. It turns out it's very hard to act inappropriately towards the Queen when you are missing your head. Well, following Edward's death on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15, his will disregarded the Succession to the Crown Act of 1543, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth as heirs, and instead naming Lady Jane Grey, Henry VIII's great-niece, as his successor. Well, you can see how this is a bit of a problem. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen by the Privy Council, but her reign was short-lived, lasting only 9 days, as support for her quickly dissipated. On August the 3rd, 1553, Mary triumphantly entered London, accompanied by Elizabeth. Initially, the relationship between the sisters appeared from the outside to be very harmonious. But, as with all struggles for power, and unfortunately family affairs, things soured quite quickly. Well, you see, Mary, she was a staunch Catholic, and Catholics are traditionally not very keen on Protestantism. Thus, Mary aimed to suppress Protestantism, which Elizabeth had been raised in. You can see the problem here. Mary enforced attendance at Catholic Mass, forcing Elizabeth to conform, outwardly at least. Thus Mary's popularity dwindled in 1554, when she announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, who was also a devout Catholic. Thus discontent spread across the nation, with many turning to Elizabeth as a symbol of opposition to Mary's religious policies. In January and February of 1554, Wyatt's rebellion erupted, but was swiftly quashed. Elizabeth was summoned to court and questioned about her involvement. Despite her protests of innocence, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London on March 18, 1554. And while there is little evidence that she had conspired with the rebels, some had attempted to have communication with her. Some had even approached her. Mary's advisor, Simon Renard, argued that Elizabeth posed a threat to her throne, which was technically true. Elizabeth's supporters, including William Paget, Baron Paget, persuaded Mary to spare her sister's life due to a lack of concrete evidence against her. And, spoiler alert, the life was spared. On May 22nd, 1554, Elizabeth was transferred from the Tower to Woodstock, where she remained under house arrest for nearly a year, under the supervision of Henry Bedingfield. Her journey elicited cheers from the crowds. In the April of 1555, Elizabeth returned to court as Mary's apparent pregnancy had advanced. If Mary and her child died, which was a very likely scenario in those days. Women dying during childbirth was extremely common. Elizabeth would ascend the throne. However, when it became evident that Mary was not pregnant, Elizabeth's prospects of becoming queen increased. Acknowledging these shifting politics, King Philip, who became King of Spain in 1556, sought to cultivate Elizabeth as an ally. She was, after all, a preferable option to Mary, who was betrothed to the Dauphin of France. While Elizabeth received visitors at Hatfield House, where she had been living since October 1555. By October 1558, she was already preparing for her reign. Mary formally recognized Elizabeth as her heir on November the 6th, 1558, and when Mary died on November the 17th, Elizabeth ascended to the throne. She had become queen at the age of 25, and she immediately communicated her intentions to her council and peers who had gathered at Hatfield to pledge their allegiance. In her speech, Elizabeth expressed great sorrow for her sister's passing, acknowledging the weight of the responsibility that was now suddenly placed upon her. She invoked the concept of the sovereign two bodies, distinguishing between the natural and the political. And here is a quote from her. "My lords, the law of nature moves me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that is fallen upon me makes me amazed, and yet, considering I am God's creature, ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have assistance of his grace to be the minister of his heavenly will in this office now committed to me. And as I am but one body naturally considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern, so shall I desire you all to be assistant to me, that I with my ruling and you with your service may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort for our posterity on earth. I mean to direct all my actions by good advice and counsel." Well, as Elizabeth's procession moved through the city on the eve of her coronation, she received an overwhelmingly enthusiastic welcome from the citizens. Orations and pageants, many with a very obvious Protestant theme, greeted her along the way. Her gracious responses endeared her to the spectators. Well, on January 15th, 1559, a date chosen by her astrologer, John Dee, Elizabeth was crowned and anointed by Owen Oglethorpe, the Catholic Bishop of Carlisle, in Westminster Abbey. Amidst all of the organs and fifes, bells and trumpets and drums, she was presented for the people's acceptance, and accept her she did. Well, while Elizabeth was welcomed as a queen in England, the country remained apprehensive about perceived Catholic threats, not just at home, but abroad, as well as uncertainties surrounding her choice of a spouse. Her religious convictions have been a subject of scholarly debate, by the way. While she did identify as a Protestant, she maintained a lot of Catholic symbolism, such as the crucifix, and minimalized the importance of sermons, which was contrary to the fundamental belief of Protestantism, so, yeah. While recognizing the potential threat of a Catholic crusade against England due to her heretical status, Elizabeth and her advisors pursued a Protestant solution that aimed to appease Catholics to some extent, while addressing the demands of the English Protestants. However, she remained staunchly opposed to the Puritans, whose reforms were just too extensive. In 1559, the Parliament began to enact legislation for a church that was modelled on the Protestant settlements of Edward VI, with the monarchy serving as its head, but retaining many Catholic elements, including certain vestments. Kind of like going to a bit of a buffet. Just take the things you like and bring it back to the table and have a nice little meal. But this time it was for religion. Well, while the House of Commons strongly supported these proposals, the Bill of Supremacy encountered resistance in the House of Lords, particularly from, guess who, the bishops. Elizabeth benefited from the fact that many bishoprics were vacant at the time, including the Archbishopric of Canterbury. This allowed her supporters among the peers to outnumber and simply outvote the bishops and conservative peers. Despite this, Elizabeth had to concede the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, rather than the more contentious title of Supreme Head, which many deemed inappropriate for a woman to hold. The new Act of Supremacy was enacted on May the 8th, 1559. It mandated that all public officials swear an oath of loyalty to the monarch as the supreme governor, or you get fired. That's right, full disqualification from office. Additionally, the heresy laws were repealed to prevent the persecution of dissenters experienced during Mary's reign. Simultaneously, the Parliament passed a new Act of Uniformity, which mandated attendance at church services and the use of the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, although the penalties for non-compliance, known as resuscency by the way, were really not very severe, and not really enforced anyway. Since the outset of Elizabeth's reign, the expectation of her marriage loomed large, sparking speculation about potential suitors. And there were plenty of them too. Apparently she was quite the dish. Well, despite receiving numerous proposals, she never married and remained childless. You go, girl, leaving historians to speculate about the reasons behind her decision. Well, unfortunately, some do suggest that her experiences with Thomas Seymour may have soured her on the entire idea of romantic relationships. Perhaps so, but that's a bit of speculation. Throughout her life, Elizabeth entertained various suitors, considering marriage until she reached the age of 50. Her final courtship was with Francis, the Duke of Anjou, who was, by the way, significantly younger than her. While marriage presented the opportunity for an heir, it also posed risks, potentially jeopardizing her power or inciting political instability. Well, in the spring of 1559, it became very apparent that Elizabeth had harbored romantic feelings for her childhood friend, Robert Dudley. Rumors circulated that she would marry him if his wife Amy were to die. Okay. Well, guess what happened? Amy's death in September 1560 sparked suspicions of foul play. How did she die? Well, apparently she fell down the stairs. Right. Well, many, of course, pointed the finger at Dudley to orchestrate this entire thing so that he could marry Elizabeth. And it all seems a little bit too convenient, doesn't it? You don't have to be Hercule Poirot to figure this one out. Well, despite Elizabeth's contemplation of marrying Dudley, opposition from her advisers and conservative peers, as well as the rumors of a potential uprising, dissuaded her. Well, Dudley, he had to find another wife, didn't he? He was down a wife right now and needed to fill that void. So his marriage to Lettice Knollys, yes, a real name, in 1578, had apparently stirred Elizabeth's displeasure. But even so, he had apparently remained central to her emotional life. He died shortly after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, leaving behind a note addressed to Elizabeth, discovered among her personal effects after her death. That's right, she kept it all that time. Certainly shows that old Dudley meant quite a lot to her. Well, marriage negotiations played a pivotal role in Elizabeth's foreign policy strategy. In 1559 she declined the proposal from Philip II of Spain, her half-sister's widower, but she did remain open to other potential matches, including King Eric XV of Sweden. Earlier discussions had also broached the idea of a Danish alliance, with proposals from Henry VIII for a match with the Danish Prince Adolf, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and later from Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, for a union with Prince Frederick, later Frederick II of Denmark, although these talks had stalled by 1551. As Sweden courted Elizabeth, King Frederick II of Denmark proposed to her, in the late 1559, to counterbalance Sweden's advances. Elizabeth also entertained the prospect of marriage to Charles II, Archduke of Austria, a cousin of Philip II of Spain. But unfortunately in 1569, relations with the Habsburgs had soured somewhat. So, one more thrown on the no pile. In the subsequent years, Elizabeth explored marriages with French Valois princes, initially with Henry, the Duke of Anjou, and later with his brother, Francis, also the Duke of Anjou, who had been the Duke of Alençon. The proposal with Francis was linked to plans for an alliance against Spanish control in the southern Netherlands. Elizabeth appeared to take the courtship seriously, for a time, even wearing frog-shaped earrings gifted by Francis, and apparently she had referred to Francis quite a lot as her little frog, which is, I think, quite funny. Well, however, Elizabeth's attitude towards marriage evolved over time. In 1563, she confided to an imperial envoy her inclination to simply remain single, forever, preferring a modest life, a quiet one, over all the nonsense and responsibilities of queenhood. Despite pressure from Parliament to marry or designate an heir, particularly following her illness with smallpox in 1563, Elizabeth had dug her heels in. She was not letting anybody tell her what to do. Tradition be damned. She prorogued Parliament in April of 1563, resuming only when she needed its support for taxation in 1566. I bet all the members of Parliament got paid anyway. Ugh. Well, by 1570, it was widely accepted among her senior government figures that Elizabeth would simply never marry, or even name a successor. William Cecil, her trusted advisor, began considering alternative solutions to the succession issue. Her decision not to marry was often criticized, but she saw it as a means of safeguarding her political security, recognizing that naming an heir could make her vulnerable to plots and coups, as had been the case for her predecessor, and, well, if anyone's been watching the other videos, pretty much everyone else. Elizabeth's unmarried status gave a kind of rise to a cult of virginity, drawing parallels to the Virgin Mary. In art and literature, she was often depicted as a virgin or a divine figure, rather than a mortal woman. Initially, Elizabeth herself emphasized her virginity, declaring to the Commons, and I quote in 1559, "And, in the end, this shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin." Later, poets and writers elaborated on this theme, elevating Elizabeth to an iconic status. While public displays of devotion to the Virgin Mary in 1578 were interpreted as veiled opposition to Elizabeth's marriage negotiations with the Duke of Alençon, Elizabeth herself maintained that she was wedded to her kingdom and subjects, under divine protection, declaring in 1599, "All my husbands, my good people." That's sweet, yeah. However, not everyone accepted Elizabeth's claim of virginity. A few eyebrows were raised. Catholic eyebrows. Well, the Catholics accused her of engaging in sinful behavior that tainted the nation symbolically. Actually, Henry IV of France, not of England, of France, famously questioned whether Elizabeth was truly a virgin at all. Very salacious. A contentious issue surrounding Elizabeth's virginity was whether she consummated her relationship with Robert Dudley. In 1559, she had Dudley's bedchambers moved next to her own, and in 1561 she fell mysteriously ill, causing her body to swell. Probably a coincidence. In 1587, a young man named Arthur Dudley was apprehended of suspicion of espionage in Spain, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. Arthur's age aligned with the 1561 illness. While he provided a detailed account of his life, including his upbringing in the royal palace, his story, well, it wasn't quite good enough to convince the Spanish authorities, and modern scholars mostly dismissed the notion of Elizabeth concealing a pregnancy, citing the intense scrutiny of her life by contemporaries. She just wouldn't have gotten away with it. Now, on to Mary, Queen of Scots. We're going to backpedal a little bit now. Talk about her rivalry with Mary for a little bit, if you would permit me to do so. So, we're going back to around 1560 on the timeline, okay? Elizabeth initially opposed the French presence in Scotland, fearing that they aimed to invade England and install her Catholic cousin Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Mary, being the granddaughter of Henry VIII's elder sister Margaret, was considered by many to be the rightful heir to the English crown. Elizabeth, persuaded by the threat posed by Mary and the French, supported Protestant rebels in Scotland, culminating in the Treaty of Edinburgh in July of 1560, which effectively removed the French threat from the north. Upon Mary's return to Scotland in 1561, the country had embraced Protestantism, and a council of Protestant nobles, supported by Elizabeth, now governed it. Despite Elizabeth's efforts to maintain control, Mary refused to ratify the treaty. This, of course, put the two at odds, certainly a strained relationship. Well, in 1563, Elizabeth proposed her own suitor, Robert Dudley, as a husband for Mary, but both Mary and Dudley showed very little interest. Instead, in 1565, Mary married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who also had a claim to the English throne, but not a very strong one. However, Darnley, well, everybody hated him, and because of his severe unpopularity, he was murdered in 1567, likely orchestrated by James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, whom Mary subsequently married not long after. I'm sure that Darnley was turning in his grave over that one. Well, Elizabeth, who was suspicious of Mary's involvement in Darnley's death, confronted her about the hasty marriage, and you can see how this all went. One can only imagine the conversation between the two. These events, well, they ultimately led to Mary's downfall. It was all pretty obvious what had happened. Well, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her son, James VI, and then she was thrown into the Lochleven Castle prison, not a nice place to be. Although she did manage to escape in 1568, her defeat at the Battle of Langside led her to seek refuge in England, where she had hoped, somewhat misguidedly, for Elizabeth's support. However, rather than risk political instability, Elizabeth chose to detain Mary in England for the next 19 years, unwilling to commit to either returning her to Scotland or sending her to France. Mary thus became the focal point of rebellion in England, particularly among Catholics. In 1569, a significant Catholic uprising occurred in the north, with the primary goal of freeing Mary, marrying her to Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and installing her as the English Queen. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, leading to over 750 executions on Elizabeth's direct orders. Pope Pius V responded to the revolt's perceived success by issuing the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis in 1570, excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her a heretic, thereby releasing her subjects from allegiance to her. The papal bull, of course, intensified anti-Catholic sentiment in England and prompted legislative measures against Catholics by Parliament. These measures, although severe, were somewhat mitigated by Elizabeth's direct intervention. For example, in 1581, converting English subjects to Catholicism with the intent to withdraw them from allegiance to Elizabeth was made a treasonable offence. And, of course, the punishment for treason was getting your head removed. From the 1570s, missionary priests from continental seminaries clandestinely entered England with the aim of reconverting the country to Catholicism, a dangerous mission indeed. Well, not many of these priests managed to do the job for very long. They were found and executed. But this had the effect of somewhat fostering this cult of martyrdom among the English Catholics. Remember the whole thing of the New Testament, Jesus saying they persecuted me first. Well, now they're persecuting you. Well, they must be persecuting us because we're on Jesus' side. Well, becomes a little bit difficult when everybody wants God on their team. Well, regnans in excelsis, that papal bull, provided English Catholics with a compelling reason to view Mary as the rightful sovereign of England. Although Mary might not have been directly involved in every Catholic plot to place her on the English throne, evidence such as the Ridolfi plot in 1571 and the Babington plot of 1586 do quite a lot to suggest her utmost complicity. Elizabeth's spy master, yes, they had them back then, Francis Walsingham, and the Royal Council diligently gathered evidence. Initially, Elizabeth resisted calls for Mary's execution, thinking it was a little bit in poor taste. However, by the late 1586, she had run out of patience. She approved Mary's trial and execution based on letters intercepted during the aforementioned Babington plot. Mary was, therefore, beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February 1587. Elizabeth later claimed that she had not intended for the execution warrant to be dispatched, and blamed her secretary, William Davison, for its implementation without her knowledge. However, doubts remain about the sincerity of Elizabeth's remorse and her true intentions regarding the execution. Now, away from Mary, Queen of Scots, let's talk about a little bit of policy. Foreign policy first, which was primarily defensive in nature, except for a few instances where aggressive actions had to be taken, such as the English occupation of Le Havre from October 1562 to June of 1563. Elizabeth had this goal with Le Havre, to eventually exchange it for Calais, the port city on the mainland, which had been lost to France in 1558. However, the occupation ended in failure when her Huguenot allies joined with the Catholics to retake the port, which no one really saw that one coming, Huguenots being Protestants who were constantly at odds with the Catholics in France. Watch my video about the French Wars of Religion. Now that's one to have with dinner. Well, throughout her reign, Elizabeth relied heavily on her fleets to pursue an aggressive policy, particularly in conflicts against Spain. The Anglo-Spanish War, which saw around 80% of its battles fought at sea, was a significant example of this strategy. Elizabeth actually knighted Francis Drake after his circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580. Drake became famous for his raids on Spanish ports and fleets, contributing significantly to England's naval power. And just a few days ago, I did a video about him. You might want to go watch it. Quite interesting. Well, despite all these maritime successes, Elizabeth largely avoided military expeditions on the continent, at least until 1585. In that year, she sent an English army to aid the Protestant Dutch rebels against Philip II of Spain. This decision came after the deaths of key allies and the surrender of Dutch towns to Spanish forces. The Treaty of Nonsuch in August 1585 marked the beginning of the Anglo-Spanish War, which lasted until the Treaty of London, almost 20 years later, in 1604. The expedition to aid the Dutch was led by the Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's former suitor. However, Elizabeth was not fully supportive of this course of action. She initiated secret peace talks with Spain shortly after Leicester's arrival in Holland, which contradicted Leicester's plans for active military engagement. Elizabeth didn't want that. She wanted to avoid decisive action with the enemy, while Leicester, well, he was more on an aggressive approach, intending to fight actively. Their conflicting strategies led to tensions between them, exacerbated by Leicester's acceptance of the post of Governor-General from the Dutch States General without Elizabeth's consent. Elizabeth's reluctance to fully commit to the Dutch cause, combined with Leicester's political and military shortcomings, and the chaotic situation in Dutch politics, ultimately led to the complete failure of this campaign. Elizabeth repeatedly refused to send the promised funds for her soldiers, undermining the military effort, and Leicester, well, he eventually resigned from his command in December of 1587, ending a chapter in Elizabeth's foreign policy characterized by hesitancy and internal discord. The expeditions of Francis Drake against Spanish ports and ships in the Caribbean in 1585 and 86, along with his successful raid on Cadiz in 1587, played its own role in weakening the Spanish naval power and disrupting Philip II's plans for enterprise in England. These actions demonstrated England's ability to strike at the very heart of Spanish maritime interests, and ultimately thwarted Philip's attempts to launch a full-scale invasion of England. The Spanish Armada, a formidable fleet of ships assembled by Philip II, set sail for the English Channel on the 12th of July 1588, with the intention of ferrying a Spanish invasion force under the Duke of Parma from the Netherlands to the coast of southeast England. However, they encountered a series of setbacks, including miscalculations, misfortune, and of course the devastating attack by a group of English fire ships. Well, that was admittedly the main issue. This attack occurred off Gravelands on the 28th to the 29th of July. Certainly a night to remember. Well, this led to the dispersion of the Spanish fleet, and its eventual straggled return to Spain, where significant losses occurred along the way, particularly off the coast of Ireland. You see, they couldn't just sail back the same way. No, too many English fire ships. They had to go all the way up and all the way around. And let's just say the North Sea Passage is not very kind that type of year. Well, in response to this perceived threat of invasion, English militias were also mustered under the command of the Earl of Leicester. Yes, the boats were sank, but he just wanted to make sure. No harm in boots on the ground, right? Elizabeth, displaying her characteristic courage and resolve, addressed her troops at Tilbury on the 8th of August, declaring her determination to defend her realm against any and all foreign aggression. Her famous speech to the troops at Tilbury emphasized her faith in her loyal subjects and her commitment to protecting England from invasion. Thus, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was celebrated as a triumph for Protestant England and a testament to Elizabeth's leadership. That ground invasion? Well, it never really came. Either way, the boats were sank, and it bolstered national morale, reinforcing the perception of Elizabeth as a strong and capable monarch. Who needs a husband anyway? Well, not her, apparently. However, the victory did not end the conflict with Spain, and the war continued. In fact, despite all of the losses, the continuing war often favored the Spanish, who still maintained control over the southern provinces of the Netherlands. In 1589, Elizabeth launched the English Armada, or the Counter Armada, whichever we want to call it. I think English Armada sounds cooler. Well, this was led by Francis Drake, very experienced, and John Norreys, in an attempt to retaliate against Spain. Well, despite having Francis Drake on their side, the expedition ended in disaster, with heavy casualties suffered by the English fleet, and really no significant gains made at all. The defeat marked a setback for England, and allowed Spain to regain its naval superiority in the following years. Despite the failure of the English Armada, Elizabeth's resolve to defend her realm remained undiminished. Her involvement in France after the Protestant Henry IV inherited the French throne in 1589 marked another shift in foreign policy. Concerned about the potential threat posed by a Spanish takeover of the Channel ports and eager to support a Protestant ally, Elizabeth dispatched military support to Henry IV, her first venture into France since the failed English occupation of Le Havre in 1563. However, the English campaigns in France proved to be disorganized and ultimately ineffective. Peregrine Berthier's campaign in northern France in 1589 ended in disarray, and half of his troops were simply evaporated under the French forces. Better luck next time, kid. John Norreys' expedition to Brittany, yes, the same one who was in the Armada in 1591, was even more disastrous, and it resulted in the near destruction of his army by a force from the Catholic League. Elizabeth's reluctance to invest in supplies and reinforcements for her commanders hindered their efforts, leading to even more setbacks. In July of 1589, Elizabeth sent Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, to aid Henry IV in besieging Rouen. However, Essex's campaign yielded little success, and Henry ultimately abandoned the siege in April of 1592. Elizabeth then struggled to maintain control over her commanders once they were abroad, often expressing frustration at the lack of communication and progress. In addition to her challenges in France, Elizabeth faced significant opposition in nearby Ireland, where a predominantly Catholic population resisted English authority. Old habits die hard, it seems. The 9 Years' War, which erupted in 1594 and lasted until 1603, posed a severe test for Elizabeth's rule. Rebel leader Hugh O'Neill, backed by Spain, led a revolt against English control. Despite efforts to quell the rebellion, including sending Robert Devereux to Ireland in 1599, Elizabeth encountered difficulties in achieving meaningful victories. Throughout her reign, she also maintained diplomatic relations with the Tsardom of Russia, initially established by her half-brother Edward VI. Despite occasional tensions, particularly over trade and military alliances, Elizabeth's correspondence with Tsar Ivan the Terrible remained generally amicable. However, Ivan's successor, Fyodor I, adopted a more open approach to foreign relations, dismissing English trading privileges and rejecting Elizabeth's proposals for an alliance. Now who's terrible? Well, during Elizabeth's reign, England also expanded its trade and diplomatic relations with the Barbary states, particularly Morocco. Despite a papal ban and opposition from Spain, England established a trading relationship with Morocco, exchanging armor, ammunition, timber, and metal for Moroccan sugar. It was a sweet deal, I suppose. Well, in 1600, Abd-ul-Wahed ben Masoud, an ambassador from the Moroccan ruler Mulay Ahmad al-Mansur, visited England to negotiate an alliance against Spain. After all, they were quite close as well. And, well, living memory of the Reconquista. I suppose that one is hard to get out of the nightmares. Well, this did indicate a potential for cooperation between the two powers, but I don't think the Pope would have liked that very much. Well, don't forget about the Ottoman Empire, the Pope's best friends. Diplomatic ties were also forged with them too, with the establishment of the Levant Company and the dispatch of the first English ambassador, William Harborne, to the Ottoman capital in 1578. What a job! Well, the Treaty of Commerce was signed in 1580, and there were numerous exchanges of envoys and correspondence between Elizabeth and Sultan Murad III. Murad even entertained the idea of an alliance between Protestant England and the Ottoman Empire, considering their shared rejection of idol worship. Elizabeth's government exported tin, lead, and even ammunition to the Ottomans, and there were discussions of joint military operations against Spain during the outbreak of war in 1585. Well, in the realm of exploration under Elizabeth's reign, Humphrey Gilbert sailed to Newfoundland in 1583 with the aim of establishing a colony, while his half-brother, I'm sure you know of him, Walter Raleigh, explored the Atlantic coast and claimed territory in present-day Virginia, possibly named in honor of Elizabeth. You know, Virginia, Virgin, the Virgin Queen. That's pretty much it. Well, Raleigh also attempted to establish colonies in Virginia, landing on Roanoke Island in 1585 and 1590, though the fate of these ventures still remains a little uncertain. And of course, the big one that eventually grew a little too big for its boots, and eventually when I make a video about it will probably be 4 hours long, the East India Company, founded in 1600 with a charter from Queen Elizabeth granting it a complete monopoly on English trade in the Indian Ocean and China. Commanded by James Lancaster, the company embarked on its first expedition in 1601, becoming a dominant force in global trade and acquiring substantial territory in India during the 18th and 19th centuries. While the period following the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was marked by significant challenges for Elizabeth, which persisted until the end of her reign, which we are quickly approaching. Ongoing conflicts with Spain and in Ireland, coupled with heavy taxation and economic hardships resulting from poor harvests and the costs of war, strained the nation. Raising prices and declining living standards added to the populace's woes. Sounds familiar? Well, in response to internal dissent and the threat of Catholic opposition, Elizabeth intensified repression against Catholics, authorizing commissions to interrogate and monitor Catholic households. To maintain a facade of peace and prosperity, she increasingly relied on internal spies and propaganda, once again sounding all a little familiar. While Elizabeth's later years saw a shift in the character of her government, particularly her Privy Council in the 1590s. Many of her key advisors had already passed away, leaving a new generation in power. Factional strife within the government, which had not been prominent before the 1590s, became a defining feature of daily politics, and a bitter rivalry emerged between Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and Robert Cecil, son of Lord Berkeley, each backed by their own numerous supporters, further complicating governance and diminishing the Queen's personal authority. As her reign progressed, Elizabeth resorted to granting monopolies as a form of patronage to courtiers instead of seeking additional subsidies from Parliament, exacerbating public resentment. This practice led to price fixing and widespread discontent. The culmination of this discontent was evident in the agitation within the House of Commons during the Parliament of 1601. In response, Elizabeth delivered her famous Golden Speech in November of 1601 at Whitehall Palace, where she professed ignorance of the abuses and sought to appease the members with promises and appeals to their emotions. Here's a quick little excerpt of her speech. Who keeps their sovereign from the lapse of error, in which by ignorance and not by intent they might have fallen? What thank they deserve, we know, though you may guess. And as nothing is more dear to us than the loving conservation of our subjects' hearts, with an undeserved doubt might we have incurred if the abusers of our liberality, the thrallers of our people, the wringers of the poor, had not been told us. Yes, language is a little old, I know. Well, despite the economic and political uncertainties of Elizabeth's later years, England experienced an unparalleled literary renaissance. So, everyone was poor, but hey, at least the books were good. The emergence of a new literary movement began towards the end of the second decade of Elizabeth's reign, marked by works such as John Lilly's Euphues and Edmund Spenser's The Shepherd's Calendar in 1578. Do look them up. And of course, by the 1590s, some of the greatest names in English literature, including William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, reached their peak, leading to the zenith of the English theatre continuing into the Jacobean era. The Elizabethan era's greatness owes much to the contribution of its builders, dramatists, poets, and musicians, rather than the direct patronage of the Queen herself, who was actually not a significant supporter of the arts, but at least she wasn't a repressor of them. Well, by this point, she was getting on a bit. As Elizabeth aged, her public image underwent a transformation. She was depicted as various mythological figures, including Belphoebe, Astrea, and Gloriana, the eternally youthful fairy queen from Edmund Spenser's poem. Despite the idealized portraits, Elizabeth's physical appearance was marred by smallpox scars, leading to dependency on wigs and cosmetics. Her oral health also deteriorated significantly due to severe tooth decay, and many of the teeth had actually fallen out at this point, making it difficult for foreign ambassadors to understand what the hell she was saying. Yes, kind of hard to pronounce those L's and F's without any front teeth, I'm afraid. However, despite these physical challenges, Elizabeth's courtiers continued to praise her beauty, and she herself embraced the role, possibly even believing her own performance in the final years. Her fondness for the charming yet impetuous Earl of Essex, despite his repeated indiscretions, illustrates her personal vulnerabilities. Despite his desertion and attempted rebellion in 1601, Elizabeth was deeply affected by Essex's fate, recognizing her own misjudgments as contributing factors. Lord Burghley's death in 1598 marked a significant transition in the Elizabethan government, with his son Robert Cecil assuming the role of senior advisor and de facto leader of the government. One of Robert Cecil's key tasks was to ensure a smooth succession upon Elizabeth's death, as she had still never officially named a successor. In secret negotiations, Cecil engaged with James VI of Scotland, who had a strong claim to the English throne. Through coded correspondence, Cecil coached James on how to approach Elizabeth, advising him to humor her and avoid too many unnecessary questions. And Elizabeth responded favorably to James's tone, indicating her implicit approval of him as her successor. Well, until the autumn of 1602, her health had remained relatively stable, apart from the teeth, when a series of deaths among her close friends plunged her into severe depression. In March of 1603, Elizabeth fell seriously ill, exhibiting signs of a deep depression and melancholy. Despite her reluctance, Robert Cecil insisted that she retire to bed and rest, to which she defiantly replied that must is not a word to use to princes, little man. Well, it wasn't long after that little man comment, it was very unnecessary, that she passed away on the 24th of March 1603 at Richmond Palace. Cecil and the council promptly proclaimed James as the new King of England. And well, although her death is conveniently recorded as occurring in 1603, in England at the time followed the Julian calendar, where the new year actually began on the 25th of March. Hence, by the modern calendar, Elizabeth actually died on the last day of 1602. But now we're just getting technical. Well, eventually a funeral procession came, and it was held on the 28th of April. And it was a somber affair, led down with these horses draped in these black draperies, with a large procession through the streets, thousands of people gathering to witness her interment at Westminster Abbey alongside her half-sister Mary. In the words of the chronicler John Stowe, Westminster was surcharged with multitudes of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, windows, leads and gutters, that came out to see the obsequies. And when they beheld her statue lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping, as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. And with that, we reach the end of our biography of Elizabeth I. I would like to thank my top-tier patrons, Star Factory, JC and Jeffrey. And if you have reached this point of the video without clicking off or without falling asleep, I think it's only fair that you say a hello in the comments below or subscribe and like the video. It's a fair trade, don't you think? And with that, I will wish you all the best, and I will see you next time, same place, right here on YouTube, where the history never stops. Good night, everybody. Love you all dearly.